So my name is Deepa Manclair. I am the lay member for Northern Ireland for the GMC Council, and I'm honoured to be chairing today's panel. Welcome to all of you who are in this room. Welcome to everybody who is online. Hopefully you're all still with us today. So we're exploring the topic of sexism, sexual harassment, and assault in the healthcare workforce. There have been significant recent reports, and what we want to do today is to seek to understand how we and others can tackle and prevent all forms of sexism and fight sexual harassment and abuse in medicine. So delegates are going to be asked to respond to a couple of poll questions as we go through the session, and you'll also be able to ask questions as well, both delegates online and in person. So make sure that you've got the conference app open, as that's how we'll be responding and asking questions. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our amazing panelists here. So first of all, we have Chelsea Jewett, who is an emergency medicine trainee working in the Northwest Mersey region. She was inspired to create the Sexism in Medicine project following events that she has experienced throughout her own career. We then have Sarah Hillman, who is a GP and an academic clinical lecturer at Warwick Medical School. And Sarah researches women's health in the community and has spoken at TEDx NHS about the need for medical feminism. Then we have Tamsin Cumming, who is a consultant colorectal surgeon at Homerton University Hospital and the chair of the Women in Surgery Forum at the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Tamsin is also co-chair of the newly formed Working Party on Sexual Assault in Surgery. And then at the end, we have Paul Deemer, who is head of diversity and inclusion with NHS employers. He also works with the Chartered Institute of Linguists and the Recruitment Industry Disability Initiative. So welcome all of you, and thank you for being here. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the sensitive nature of the topic that we're discussing today. And if anybody finds the conversation difficult to hear or participate in, then the team are going to be signposting support mechanisms and platforms. So next, I would like to welcome Claire Light, who is Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the GMC, who is going to be our opening speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa, and welcome to everyone online and in the room who's joined today's workshop. My role today is to start discussions with some scene setting and sharing some of our data and insight, firstly on the representation of women in the workforce and also some of the evidence from our recent surveys, both ours and the BMA, and to really describe the scale of the challenge the medical profession faces. The makeup of the register, as you might expect, has dramatically changed since the GMC was first established in 1858. Then only one female doctor was on the first ever register, and this increased to only 12% in the 50 years that followed. But female representation in the profession has increased dramatically in more recent years. In the last 5 years, there was a close to 20% year-on-year increase in the number of female doctors within the workforce, and that compared to only a 13% increase for male doctors. The increases in female doctors joining the register in more recent decades has meant that the workforce is more proportionate, with now 47% female. When we look in a bit more detail, we can see that this isn't evenly split across the register or in specialties. Female doctors make up over 50% of the GP workforce, but less than 40% of the specialist workforce. However, this is set to change in the future, with over half of the trainee workforce at 56.4% currently being female. But most specialties are still male-dominated. The most male-dominated specialty is surgery, where less than 15% are female. But the future, with 35% of trainees in surgery being female. And obs and gynae, it perhaps predictably has the most female doctors at almost 60%. So to start thinking beyond representation, which is perhaps a positive journey and a positive story, That changes if we consider some of the differences that female doctors might be experiencing in their working lives. So let's launch the first of our polls. So the question we have to you, it should be, if you're joining us online, you should be seeing the poll appear on your screen. If you're in the room with us, you should use your mobile device via the conference app if you're logged on to that. So what percentage of female doctors felt unable to cope with their workload at least once a week in 2021? Is it A, 23%, B, 33%, or C, 43%? So put your answers into the poll now. Can I just check, is it loading for everyone? It's there, I can see some nods, brilliant, thank you. And hopefully you'll be getting the answer correct. Let's see if we can bring up the result. 23% thought A, 33% B, and 43% thought C, or it's changing a little bit. Okay, so the actual answer to the question is 33%. So that's a third of female doctors felt unable to cope with their workload at least once a week in 2021, and this compares to 26% for male doctors. But workloads aren't the only aspect in terms of their role that female doctors struggled in 2021. 62% worked beyond their rostered hours at least once a week, and that compared to 55% of male doctors. And 30% found it difficult to take breaks due to the intensity of their workload at least once a week, and that compared to 22% of their male counterparts. These are a handful of the many differences that female doctors indicate are a reality in their working lives. And as Dame Kerry said earlier, that may not solely be as a result of sexism in the workplace, but this must play a role. Beyond higher workloads and feeling unable to cope, staggeringly 90% of women stated they had experienced sexism at work in the last 2 years, and almost half of respondents who experienced or witnessed sexism chose not to report it. This data is taken from a recent BMA survey, which found that 70% of women felt their clinical ability had been doubted or undervalued, and that compared to only 12% of men. 2/3 believe that this negatively impacted on their career. And 60% of women also felt that they were made to feel uncomfortable at work by being asked about children or their intention to have children. So why are doctors leaving the profession? We also see differences in the reasons why male and female doctors might want to leave the profession. Male doctors tended to cite financial reasons or pension concerns as their motivation, and were more likely to be dissatisfied. Female doctors were motivated by childcare and maternity leave, and more because they were burnt out. You could argue that one positive story is the smallest reason for leaving category from our recent survey is that sexual harassment is at 0.25%. But this is still 8 times more likely for female doctors than it is for male doctors. And whilst this might seem small, it translates to 96 individual female doctors leaving the profession. And we know that underreporting is significant, so that number could be even greater. And all this seems unbelievable in the context of some of the positive changes on gender equality that we have seen over the years more broadly, and the evidence of the extent of the problem in a regulated profession like medicine seems so stark. A report recently published by the Royal College of Surgeons entitled Sexual Assault in Surgery, A Painful Truth, covers some of the concerns specifically in surgery, and some of the first lines of that report are really difficult to hear. Surgery and surgical training have a problem with sexual harassment, sexual assault and rape. It's an uncomfortable truth, but a truth nonetheless. And with the lowest level of female representation in surgery, and the future being an increasing number of women in the surgical training pathway, it's important for us to have these discussions today. Tamsin is with us today and will share her thoughts on the journey that the surgical community is embarking on. But since this report is published, more testimonies have come forward. So So our final poll for today is: how many times were male doctors more likely than female doctors to be the subject of complaints regarding discrimination of a colleague due to the colleague's sex, gender or sexual orientation? So this is sharing some of our fitness to practice data with you all today. And you should have the poll launching on your events app now. If you're online or in the room, you should be able to vote. So do you think that the number of times male doctors were more likely to be the subject of complaints regarding discrimination than female doctors is 3 times more likely, 6 times more likely, or 9 times more likely? So if you haven't had a chance, choose your option on the event app now. So most of you think it's 9 times more likely. Yes, it is. Perhaps an obvious statistic, but nevertheless important to note that our data indicates that male doctors are much more likely to be reported to us for concerns of this nature. And the differences between, our data shows more differences between male and female doctors and the reasons behind their complaints. Overall, male doctors were 3 times more likely than female doctors to be the subject of a complaint where a doctor made an allegation of harassment. And 79% of the concerns raised related to physical or verbal bullying of a colleague were about male doctors. And the final slide that I want to touch on before I hand over to Deepa to hear from our really important colleagues who joined us today. I wanted to share some of the recent improvements that we've been making. We've recently been making improvements following our review into the learning of our handling of sexual abuse cases. The programme of work that followed had a wider scope and included learning from cases involving workplace sexual misconduct and harassment. The slide on the screen at the moment shows some of the progress that we've made to date. So we've developed case studies and guidance for doctors, employers and for our own staff, but perhaps most importantly also for victims and survivors. Some of this work is completed and some remains ongoing, and we recognise the importance of every improvement, but equally are open to hearing today if there's more that we can be doing. The overall message is that despite a significant increase in women joining the profession, the evidence points to an ingrained culture of sexism that still exists. Today's workshop is about identifying how we can collectively tackle this reality. Our acting chair, Dame Carrie McEwen, recently wrote a letter to the profession, sharing how personally troubled and saddened she was to read recent accounts. And I wanted to end by sharing some of what Carrie said. There's no place for this kind of behaviour in our profession. Everyone has the right to expect their colleagues to treat them with respect and to behave within appropriate professional boundaries. And we, as doctors, must speak up and challenge sexism and harassment and any other form of sexual misconduct if we experience it or witness it. So thank you for listening to this part of the session. I'm now going to hand over to Deepa for the panel.
Thank you, Claire. I think that has framed the issues really well and set the context in terms of some of the main themes. I'm going to go to Tamsin first, just because you name-checked. And the report is staggering in terms of the statistics, and even in terms of talking about assault and rape in the workplace. That sentence in itself is staggering for that to be a norm. I'd just like to sort of hear sort of reflections from you in terms of the steps that are being taken and where we're at the moment.
So, thank you, and thanks to Claire for the overview. At the Royal College of Surgeons, I think what we, the Women in Surgery Forum that I'm chair of, I think we realise this is not just an issue for women. Women make up the majority of the victims, but not all the victims. And obviously we need to get changes and action to the perpetrators, the vast number of whom are men. And that is why we've kind of reached out to others to form a sort of cross-party group as the working parties try and address this, because we're also not alone. It's not only happening in surgery, it's just that the focus is on surgery after Simon Fleming and Becky Fisher's article that Claire referred to. This was actually sort of commissioned in a special edition of the Bulletin of the Royal College of Surgeons to commemorate 30 years of the Women in Surgery group in some format at college. And I think it really sort of opened the doors. I sort of really so proud of the people who've come forward very bravely to report their stories. Some people who've never mentioned it, not felt able to report this in, say, 10 years. And we've even had sort of Philippa Jackson, who was brave enough to write a letter with her own report and put her name to it, but also said that it's been a long time since she's been able to, from when this occurred to when she was able to tell the world about it. So one of the issues we've got is that, as you and Claire have said, this is massively underreported. Anyone who's trained in surgery, and indeed, as your BMA survey showed, sexism is rife in the NHS, in working conditions, and this applies to everyone, not just doctors, nurses, midwives. Everyone working in the NHS is subject to it. But there's evidence that if you are working in an environment that is sexist, that is misogynistic, actually that enables sexual assault to take place. And it's only with these brave people coming forward telling us their stories that's really now focused minds and began a movement where we're hoping that we can, it will result in effective action.
Okay.
A lot of people have come forward, sort of present Royal College of Surgeons included, to say how, and a tweet by Sajid Javid, to say how appalled they are about these reports. And what we need now is to turn this sort of collective horror that this is actually taking place in this day and age to action. And I think that forms two parts. So one is we've got to find a way of reporting that is anonymous, that gives people whistleblower protection, that will not ruin victims' careers. And then we need to find a way of doing something about the perpetrators. There needs to be some consequences. At the moment, the people who are, certainly a survey from the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons showed that it was 75% male consultant surgeons of the people. So that's approximately, so it's not all in the groups in that survey, but these people are acting with impunity at the moment, and we don't know the impact on patients either, but there is some implication that there may be a knock-on effect for patients as well. So it couldn't be more serious, and we really need to put our heads together and our various bodies that we work with together to try and move away from just words only and start to see some changes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Tamsin. I'm going to turn to Chelsea now as well, and just link on to a point that you made towards the end. Having read your report and the work that you've done with the BMA as well, I think one of the pieces of evidence that emerged that I found surprising was the level of discrimination from patients and families faced by female physicians as well. If you could talk a little bit to that, that would be really helpful.
I think a lot of what we found in the survey is in terms of people's different behaviours and perceptions of female doctors compared to male doctors, and what the role, the additional roles and the additional jobs and tasks are expected of female doctors in comparison to their male counterparts. And I think that adds into some of the data in terms of burnout, etc. Women are being expected to do more in order to be thought of as competent and as serious as their male counterparts. And we're finding that time and time again through the anecdotal evidence in the survey that women are having to do more, try harder in order to gain the same level of recognition. There are also anecdotes and stories and people's truths about where patients have inappropriately touched them, groped them, called them inappropriate names. And that can range from sweetheart, darling, as opposed to doctor, to quite derogatory terms, particularly when that patient relative's behaviour is called out. And it's difficult in the realm of patients, etc., because there are other things to play. Have they got dementia? Are they delirious? They're unwell. but I think it also adds into the overall culture that female doctors are finding.
Okay, all right, thank you. And Sarah, in your TEDx talk, you talk about medical feminism, which, you know, I think is quite a powerful term, and the evidence that you provide in terms of the history of medicine and the study and the science of the normative white male cell almost is what it's reduced to, and in terms of how that's formed a foundation. But do you think that there is a sense that sexism is more pronounced within the medical profession because of that historical context?
Yeah, well, I think that we know historically how this profession was led by white men, and so therefore everything, you know, we learned earlier from the fantastic talk that the ladies gave from 5 times more about the way that research, for instance, was around was white men that led research. And what that really means is that women have been underrepresented as clinicians, as participants in research that's gone. And it also means that actually now, thank you, as a researcher, there's evidence coming out that women, you talked about the fact that women have to try harder clinically to reach the same levels. Exactly the same thing happens in clinical research. So we know that women, if you take women's names off grants and they go forward before a panel, that actually they've got the same chances. But as soon as people become aware of the name of the person on that grant, actually women are downgraded compared with male counterparts when going for scientific research grants.
Yeah.
So a lot of it stems not only in the clinical work that we do, but in the research that pushes our clinical boundaries forward.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the app is open, and if you have questions, start to feed those through. They will start to come through, and I will refer to them in just 1 second after I've asked Paul a question. In terms of where you sit and the role that you have, what's your sense of the system and responses to this issue? Are you picking up areas of good practice, and are we in the midst of a cultural shift on this or not?
I hope we are. That's certainly the plan. And there is a plan. You would expect this, of course, with the NHS. There's a NHS People Plan, which is the context for employers that we represent. So the NHS People Plan was published last year, and the idea is to address the issues that Chelsea mentioned, so the culture issues. Yeah, we're trying to. It's a framework for recreating, improving, I think, the culture within the NHS. And there's an important concept that's been introduced in the People Plan, which is a concept of belonging, this concept of belonging, which I think is the one that we're trying to nurture and create. It's not a panacea. There are some really big problems out there which the panel have already identified. And some structural problems as well. So we know, you talked about having to work harder, et cetera. We know there's a gender pay gap in medicine. Thankfully, there's a big piece of work that's going on if people don't know about it. There was a big review that was done, led by Professor Jane Dacre, and it's on the gender pay gap in medicine, which is ongoing work. We're represented on the panel that leads that work, which is great. And we're hoping that's going to try and address some of those issues. So we know there are structural issues. There are also ongoing problems in terms of the reporting. So we had the recent staff survey data, which has just been published. Unfortunately, it's shown a deterioration over the last year in terms of some of the areas we talked about, like harassment and bullying, etc. Assaults as well. Unfortunately, the figures have gone down over the last year. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we obviously the intention is to try and address some of these things. And can I just say as well that whilst there's some big things, a lot of this is some of the small things as well, yeah? So some of those small comments that are made to undermine, somebody talked about undermining, there's the undermining element. And that's the thing as much as anything we want to try and get rid of.
Yeah, okay, because it's iterative, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, right, the first question has come through. So what does the panel think about using 360 feedback and appraisal as a mechanism of calling out sexism in the profession? Super question. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to
Okay.
Can I just respond? My initial reaction is it sounds dangerous to the person involved. I mean, it should be a safe place, a feedback or appraisal session, but I'm not sure it's the right place to raise those. It would be ideal if it was, but somebody was talking earlier about, safe spaces, whistleblowing, protection. I think we need to have something outside of that process where people can go a safer place, perhaps. I don't know what other people think.
As a trainee, we send out MSFs for every placement or every year where you ask for that feedback and how you interact with the team, etc. It's meant to be anonymous. I don't think it is, because you only ever send it out to people that you know are going to give you good feedback. So, it's not a very good mechanism at all. And as someone who's wanted to raise incidences of sexism at work before personally, there was no way that I could have done that anonymously, because it was a one-on-one interaction. So I waited until I was moving on, and now I'm just hoping and praying that I don't rotate to that hospital again, to be honest.
I think that's the problem, essentially, is that if you're going to get genuine reporting, it needs to be anonymous, because at the moment there is no protection, and there's usually a power difference between the perpetrator and the victim. But the other thing we should mention, perhaps, is the role of bystanders and witnesses in this, because enabling people to report things they've witnessed could make a massive difference here.
Okay.
Sorry, and just to add, I'm a GP, so coming from smaller community settings, there's only so many people you can give these to. So the question of anonymity really does reduce.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Right, so next question. Thank you for all your work in regards to perpetrators and consequences and the reporting of harassment. What do you see the role of the GMC being? Is it, you have a view on that?
I think, well, for a start, the GMC has produced this workshop. And as you've all seen with the draft guidance for good medical practice, the GMC is taking action here. What we need is to know that ultimately consequences for the perpetrators will be, the ultimate consequence, apart from the whole issue of being reported to the police, is that they lose their license to practice if they have performed sexual assault, which is, it's a matter of being able to locate that person and bring it about. And we also have to think about if they are brought to a GMC fitness practice hearing for this, will this protect all of the people they work with? So not just their NHS work, but also private work. So I think the GMC has got a central role in this, but they're not the only players. And that's why it's going to be important to hear from NHS employers, because at the moment you also cannot leave it to the local hospitals, because quite often the perpetrators are very powerful people and are able to influence how that reporting is made and indeed whether it happens at all. So there's got to be a balance. I think the BMA have probably got a role too. The GMC are crucial, but they're not the only players.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting, isn't it? Because people may have heard there's going to be a central government review, isn't there, of arm's length bodies, which is being led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, which has been reported. And that's going to include bodies like the Care Quality Commission as well, in terms of what they're, because the natural place, I suppose, for people perhaps to go for that independence would be somewhere like the Care Quality Commission, perhaps, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I mean, the GMC, I mean, there is, you're quite right, Tamsin, there's a clear role around leadership and visibility in that leadership. And as you say, events like today, and also, not just focusing on the obvious things. I mean, I was reflecting earlier when people were talking and talking about the attitude towards female doctors, and of course we've sat here. Well, I sat here this afternoon. I saw the presentation from Chloe and Tinuke, and that was principally about black women, but it was about women. So there, it's about how are women experiencing being treated within the healthcare system, and I think there's a role for the GMC in terms of making those connections, not just making the connections, but then highlighting them to the right people, because they hold a position of power, obviously, as an organisation, as a representative body of doctors.
Yeah.
And we do have a role, so I'm not trying to advocate roles. NHS employees do have a role, and we hopefully are taking on that role. And we are working with the government, NHS England, NHS Improvement, who are the regulators, if you like, as well, of organisations in that respect.
Yeah, and there is something about working as a one system approach, isn't there?
Very much so.
Yeah. Okay. Discussing these issues and ensuring that we acknowledge them is important, but what will actually make things change? What do we do at organisational and departmental levels?
I think that's a really interesting question. I also think it's an absolutely huge question. I think today we're talking about sexism and sexual assault, and I think actually if we break that down into sexism, which actually I think if we're all honest, we've all possibly been victims of, but we've all probably been perpetrators of. I certainly have myself. And then we're talking about sexual assault, which is a crime. And I think what we probably need to divide those two things down, although some of the fundamental elements we could draw across the board. But actually, what can we do about sexism at organisational and departmental levels? Well, I think actually the fact that we're talking about it, I think the fact that we start calling it out if it's happened to us or we see it happen to others, and that actually that's okay, that we start becoming aware of, consciously aware of actually our unconscious biases, and I think hopefully that is beginning to change. And actually this idea of microaggressions, I don't think we were talking about that many years ago, and actually that to asking a woman who's a trainee when she's planning on having a children, and that actually she might consider this specialty because she wants to have a family, that's not okay now. But I think that the sexual assault question is a huge, big problem, and the work that Tamsin's been doing is absolutely fantastic, and I'd love to see that work now drawn out across the other Royal Colleges, and thinking about not only what happens in our large trusts, but actually what happens in community type settings as well, when actually teams are much smaller. And thinking about how we don't just think about this as doctors, but we think about this as our multidisciplinary team, because quite often these things, when there is a perpetrator, it's not just directed at, it could be directed at one doctor. Quite often there might be other people involved, our nurses, our midwives, and actually working together, we're definitely stronger.
Did anybody else on the panel want to come back?
I completely agree with you. I think the conversation is being had now, which it wasn't, particularly when I started training back in, when did I graduate? 2015. It wasn't really happening then. Whereas now this conversation is happening, and I think everyone has a personal responsibility for the collective as a whole to keep having this conversation. Because even though we're now starting to get some evidence to prove that this thing that everyone knew was happening for decades is finally like there in black and white. This is happening. So we need to keep having these conversations, not within these groups of people who agree with this, but we need to challenge those people who don't think it's a problem or completely ignore the problem altogether. Because if we aren't talking about the problem, we're also feeding into it because we're ignoring what we can do and what we can change. And I do think that the Royal Colleges are waking up now, and I think there's more, women groups within colleges. So there's WEMSIG in my own college, so Women in Emergency Medicine. There's FICM for ICM, and obviously Women in Surgery. There's the Medical Women's Federation. These groups are out there. We just need to all collaborate together, keep talking, and save the world.
Can I say as well, Deepa, that I know this might be obvious, but it's not just a female problem.
Yeah,
it's
exactly,
a male.
exactly.
And I think, Sarah, you talked about the definition of harassment. Just to remind people, harassment. You don't have to experience harassment to report it. If you see something and you don't like it, and you think it's wrong, you can also complain as well. And men have to stand up and do that as well, as much as women.
And it's usually men who are in positions of power.
Exactly.
We're still in that point. We're still at that point where more and more women are coming through in leadership positions. But it's great that we've got this bottom up, but we need the top down to pull their big boy pants up and get it sorted.
That has to be the phrase of the day.
Deepa, I was going to say, Chelsea's survey, I think, has helped because it's given us some numbers. And that's why one of the first things that the Working Party on Sexual Misconduct is going to do is going to put out a survey which is going to try and disseminate to as many people working in the NHS as possible. Because I think, as you say, talking in a group of people who are all interested, who have maybe experienced this, what we need to do is get this out to those people who think it's not an issue. And say, oh, well, it's a few people reporting anonymously on Twitter. And so that's why we need the survey in order to say, yes, it is an issue, this is the prevalence. After that, the question was, how are you going to change things? So, we're going to need education at a departmental level that everyone has to do. The Royal Australasian College, who's about 6 years ahead of us here in surgery, have put that through a sort of Operate with Respect programme. And then we need to really work out how you're going to avoid hospitals looking after their own. And, as we've also seen reported on Twitter, when people are brave enough to report, they are shushed, they are put to one side. If it's someone who's a junior doctor, FY1 doctor, or a medical student who's reporting about a professor, it's very hard for that person, if they're brave enough to come forward, to get taken seriously. So that's where we need help from NHS employers, NHS England and the GMC, because you can't expect the human resources at that hospital to stand up, on behalf of that possibly person who's only in the hospital for 6 weeks against, someone who's actually quite important to their service delivery. It's not going to happen.
I would just quickly like to highlight that the BMA are doing a lot of work on this and trying to bring forward some recommendations as to what can collectively be done by a range of the Royal Colleges. So that work is getting done behind the scenes there by a great EDI team.
Okay. Right, so next question. Given how common sexual harassment is, how would you encourage reporting of smaller, in quotation marks, incidents when most of the time women doctors are more afraid of something like sexual assault?
So I'll just say that about to start is a thing called Project S, which is going to launch sometime in the next few months, and Kate Jarman is leading that, and it's going to be an anonymous reporting system for NHS workers, and I think it's going to be very helpful for exactly this, because that's what we want to. We want the kind of the barrage of multiple reports, so that people, instead of feeling they're alone, are thinking, "Wow, this is happening to me as well." I've seen. You've got that option. I think it's a really important development, and hopefully, is going to really help us with understanding just the prevalence of this.
Okay. All right. Just a mind. I've been given time check, and I want you all to leave with a closing kind of bullet point each, and if you want to incorporate the final reflections, it's up to you. But just in terms of what would be your one key takeaway for each of the delegates here today and online, and then fast forward to a year's time, we're back here again. What do you want to see have changed? So whoever wants to take that first, I'm going to go to Paul.
I'll sort of try and say something meaningful. What I was going to say was, in answer to that last question, was talk to the nurses, because sexual harassment isn't restricted to doctors. Yeah, so I think actually talk to other professions as well, and again work together and collaboratively. The trade unions will help you in that respect, I'm sure. I can't think of anything else more meaningful to say, I'm sorry.
No, that's good. That's great. Tamsin.
So we're hoping that, by next year we'll have the reports of our survey. We'll hopefully have be working with Project S and have some evidence about what's been submitted there, and that also will have managed to have some discussions and movement forward on a plan of action involving sort of education, and also, what I'd really like to see is a regional group that could come in to a hospital where there's been a number of anonymous reports about a perpetrator and do an investigation, so that it's not, and that we somehow get this to work. But I think working with the BMA, our working party, and really collaborating for strength. So I'd like to be able to come back in a year's time and report progress.
Okay.
I suppose if every single person here could, over the next year, think about allyship, and actually, if they come across something, call it out, protect, and make sure they're there for other people, not just doctors, but the rest of the our multidisciplinary team. If they see these events happening, I think that would be a really good place to start.
In terms of what I'd like to see in a year, I'd love there to be a pledge written down, signed by all the Royal Colleges and governing bodies about what we're going to do to fix this problem, because we need collaboration, power in numbers. In terms of on an individual basis, I'd say go away and introspect, think about how your behaviours affect your interactions at work, in terms of, do you perpetuate sexism at work, or are you a victim of it, and what you can do going forwards, and just keep talking, because we just need to get this sorted.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I'm just going to move to close and thank people for submitting questions online as well. And we're going to be aiming to contact people after the event and to answer the questions that haven't been answered during the session. So there's an overwhelming evidence base, as we've discussed. The scale of the problem is large. And this, I think we have to remember, is in the increasing context of a workforce that is increasing in terms of women. And I think we've shared some of the actions that the GMC is already undertaking, and a critical part of that is the current consultation on good medical practice, which is looking at positive behaviours, which is looking at supporting cultures and leadership. So if I could encourage all of you to participate in the consultation, please do that. So we've also been capturing key themes and opportunities that have emerged through the discussion, and these are going to be picked up and brought back to the Strategic ED&I Advisory Forum. So, some of the key takeaways in terms of what the panelists have shared today are the need for anonymous reporting that is safe, consequences for perpetrators, that there's a power in the role of the ally and the bystander, the need for more robust data, that we need to operate as a one system, and that I think we're in the midst of a cultural shift on this, and that pivot, I think, is coming.